Okay, well, here we are back in Joshua again. And if you remember where we were last time we were together in Joshua, we were at Joshua chapter 9. And let's just go ahead and pull up our text. Well, there we are at 10. But in Joshua chapter 9, let's lock that where it is. Do you remember where we had the deception of the Gibeonites? Gibeon is this town about 20 miles away, 25 miles. Depends, 15 as the crow flies. They say 25 by the time you navigate the path or the roadways that would have been in that day. So you've got this town of Gibeon. And remember, as the Israelites came into the land and started conquering, they conquered Jericho, which was unthinkable. You've got to understand, Jericho was a very mighty city there located by the Jordan River. So when the Israelites conquered Jericho, that got the attention of all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. Then the next thing, they went to that little town of Ai. And that's where they had had to take a mulligan, a do-over, because the first time they had sin in the camp, and that meant that they got beaten by the inhabitants of Ai. But then they went back and fought, and it's very interesting. Again, I just will underline some of these lessons along the way, that God tells them they'll be victorious, and God gives them this time a strategy to follow. And so remember, they set the trap behind the city and draw the people out. And just as you look at that, to think that the God that makes the walls fall down at Jericho, when it comes to Ai, says you need to go toward them and then fall back and have some people stationed behind them. And God works in different ways in people's lives. And I just want to underline that, because sometimes we will see God do something a certain way and assume that this is how God will always do this thing. And then when God doesn't show up in the same way, people are sometimes disappointed. I didn't get the breakthrough. I didn't get the healing. I didn't get the answer to that prayer the way that I thought that it would be. And it turns out that sometimes the problem with that is not a problem at all. It's just God, our Father, is working in a way different from the way He worked before. He works differently in different lives. He works differently in the same lives at different times. And you've got to just understand, when we submit a need to our Heavenly Father, it is not a vending machine mentality that we said the right formula, approach the right way, and so we get it just as we ask. Our God is at work doing what He knows we need for that particular time. So we go on from there. They're there in the land, and that's when we saw in this chapter 9, where the residents of Gibeon, which is a town in the midst of Canaan, and yet they come and are very deceptive. Remember what they did in their deception. They came and purposefully made themselves look as though they had traveled a long journey. What are some of the things they did to have that apparent age in their journey? Anybody? Old clothing. Moldy bread. I really like that one. That took some forethought, you know. Take some moldy bread, okay? What else? Yeah, worn out shoes. And so everything about them looked like they had come from a long, long way. And they told Joshua, look how far we've come. You can see when we started out, our clothes were new, our shoes were new, the bread was fresh, hot out of the oven. Just picked it up at Publix on the way out of town. And then suddenly, after this long journey, look how tattered we are. And so this is the key in that chapter 9, is that when the men of Israel, talk with them and make the decision, what's the one thing that the men of Israel forget to do? To consult the Lord. They did not inquire of the Lord. And because they didn't inquire of the Lord, it turns out that they are in a covenant now with these people who deceived them, the Gibeonites. And that's what we talked about in our last lesson here. You might not remember, or maybe you weren't here, but the importance in our decision making of just seeking the Lord as we make decisions. And remember, the way that you determine the difference ahead of time between the decisions that are just small, insignificant ones and the ones that will change the course of your life? How do you make, what's the key to telling the difference? There isn't one. That's right. We don't know. We can't see it. That's something we're blinded to. And I'll say again, sometimes the decisions that look like this is a huge decision. I'd better really find out. Sometimes the whole decision passes. It's pulled away from us, and we never even encounter it then. Or some other option comes up that we fall into. And other times there are very insignificant decisions that we make that seem insignificant, but sometimes those are the ones that set the course of our life. And so what that just tells me is always we need to be praying as we are making decisions in life, praying for wisdom, praying for God to be at work, to put us at the right place that He wants us to be, doing the thing He wants us to do. I don't see that as a pressure that we've got to try to figure out some specific little, decision that we've got to make, or else we miss God's will in our life. I don't see it like that. I think we have a lot of freedom in Christ. But what I see it as is God our Father, knowing all things, is willing to give us wisdom. He's willing to give us knowledge. He's willing to be with us in those decisions. And the Israelites, they bypass that opportunity, make the covenant with the Gibeonites, then they find out afterwards that the people of Gibeon have deceived them. And the amazing thing in this is when you see the Israelites find that out, they don't go and attack the people of Gibeon. Rather, they say, well, we've made a covenant. In fact, Joshua stops the people the Israelites, they want to attack. The average Israelite's upset about this, but Joshua and the elders say, no, we can't. We've made a covenant with them. Tonight we are going to see some of the following implications of that covenant that they made with the people of Gibeon in haste. And so we are at chapter 10 and starting at verse 1, so turn there if you're not there already. Chapter 10 and verse 1 of the book of Joshua. And we read this: Now it came about when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all of its men were mighty. Therefore, Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and camped by Gibeon and fought against it. So we see what happens here in this portion is Gibeon has made peace with Israel. They did it through deception, but they've made peace with the Israelites. And now what that does is it puts the Israelites into the land pretty far, encroaching into the land of Canaan. In fact, let me show you on a map. Here is you have the battle of these 5 kings that we'll see, and I want you to see that the town of Gibeon is quite close to Jerusalem. If you were to see, that's within just a few miles to the northwest, about no more than 5 miles from Jerusalem. And it's the king of Jerusalem who goes and contacts all the other kings, the other 4, to say we need to go and do battle against Gibeon, because look at this, if the Israelites are able to walk unchecked from where they are, which is at Gilgal at the moment, and if they are able to go and travel to Gibeon, who's friendly with them now because the Gibeonites have made peace with them, then suddenly we have the Israelites within the middle of the land, and they're only 5 miles or so from Jerusalem. That's why the king of Jerusalem says, we've got to do something about this. And rather than try to do it himself, he says, we need to make a consortium, a group of kings. Let's assemble together. And together, let's repel the Israelites and also the people of Gibeon. Well, let's attack Gibeon, the ones who made peace, so that it can't be a base of operations. And so these 5 kings of these different places here are planning to go and do battle with Gibeon. And you see in the passage, the king whose name, this is the king of Jerusalem, Adonai-Zedek. You see this name here, Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem. It's interesting sometimes when we read these names in the Old Testament, they connote something in regards or denote something in regards to the person. But sometimes you've got to be careful. That can be a little deceptive, and this is an instance there because Adonai-Zedek sounds like it's really good. You know what that means? My Lord is righteous. My Lord, Adonai. Have you ever heard Adonai in the Old Testament? Yeah, Adonai, that's a word that means Lord, which can be used of the Lord, but it also can be used about false gods as well. It's like when somebody today would say, well, my God is a great God. Well, are you talking to someone who's a Christian or someone who is a Jehovah's Witness or someone who's a Muslim? Or, who are you talking to? Because we all use the same word God. Same thing here with Lord. So Adonai, my Lord is righteous. Well, that sounds great. Say, well, this is a good guy. Well, no, he's not a good guy. He's an evil guy. So what you got to ask this is not just the phrase, my Lord is righteous. You need to ask, what's the question then? Well, who is your Lord? Yeah, what Lord are you talking about? Because if you say that my Lord is righteous, that is that he's right in everything that he does. If you're speaking about the Canaanite god Baal or Molech, where they do the horrible child sacrifices, and you say, my God is righteous, suddenly, even though the words sound good, the actual meaning is far from good. And by the way, we need to always have our discernment going when we interact with people in our lives. Don't lightly take what someone says just because it sounds good or the terminology sounds like what you agree with or like to hear. Sometimes you will hear phraseology that's very pleasing to your ears, but you need to really be careful when you're discerning what somebody's saying. And maybe a teacher, maybe an author, maybe just someone that you're talking with and witnessing with them. Or maybe fellowshipping, you think, with somebody. Oh, great, I found a believer. And there are some groups that say they're Christian that if you look at what they actually teach as a group, they are very far from being Christian. And I don't want to pick on any particular groups, but let me give you one. For instance, Mormons. I've heard people say, yeah, but they're such nice people, and they believe in God and in Jesus the way we do. And if you ever study their teachings and their writings and everything they were founded on, up to what they still teach today, is very, very far from biblical truth. And we've gone through that before in classes that we teach on the cults. But, well, they sound just like us. Well, if you believe that one day, if you do everything right, you too can be a God who has your own universe, just the way Jehovah God has his own universe. Because one of the early statements that was hung to throughout was as man is, God once was, and as God is, man may one day be. So it's a whole different concept, believe me. And there's a lot of very peculiar teachings. But if you just talk with someone and you hear family values and God and Jesus and live for the Lord, and you walk away saying, wow, they sound pretty good. Be careful. Be careful. Use discernment. And what we have to do often is get people to define terms. What do you mean? Tell me, what do you mean by it? Who are you talking about? And get that information. So don't be taken in by old Adonai-Zedek. He's not really a good guy at all. In fact, he's opposed to God's people. Now remember, these nations in Canaan, they are familiar with Israel. They're familiar with the God of Israel. They have heard about the deeds that God has done in bringing his people out of Egypt, in bringing them up the east side of the Jordan River, on getting them across the Jordan, on battling and giving them victory miraculously over Jericho and Ai. And in all of that time, they have, in a sense, humanly, you could say still, after centuries, they have opportunity to repent. They have opportunity to say, let's just get out of here. But instead, they stay, and now they say, let's go attack the people who dare to make peace with the people of, and this is what it really is, with the people of the one true God who made the universe. These people dared to make a covenant of peace with the Israelites. Then let's go get them, boys. And so after Adonizedek sends out word to 4 other cities in the south, and these are cities, what they have in common, these are all in the hill country in the central part of Israel, and these are all cities that have some might and wherewithal. And let us all join together and go to Gibeon, and let's attack Gibeon. Because, see, in the minds of whether an action is good or not depends upon the heart of the people judging it. Was it good for the people of Gibeon to want to make peace with the people of the one true God? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When you look at it from a standard of God's absolute truth. But if you're judging it through people who have wicked hearts that are darkened and clinging to their idols and to their sin, to them, this act of making peace is an act of treachery and an act of absolute, it's terrible, it's horrible how they have turned their backs on us and been unfaithful. And so their answer is, let us go and wipe them off the face of the earth. And so all 5 kings with their armies come, and they gather together, and they went up, again here, with all of their armies and camped by Gibeon and fought against it. Well, that's pretty tough odds, isn't it, if you're Gibeon? 1 against 5, 5 against 1, no matter how you look at it, these are tough odds. But the men of Gibeon remember a covenant that was made between them and Israel. So, verse 6, then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. They sent word to Joshua. They sent word to the Israelites. Joshua, don't abandon your servants. Remember, that was the covenant. Okay, we get to live, but you get to live, Joshua said, but you'll be our servants. You will haul the wood and the water for the temple, for the worship of our God. And the people of Gibeon say, fine, at least we live. Now they are sending a message. Don't abandon. Literally, don't let your hands be slack, is what it says in Hebrew. Don't let your hands be slack regarding your servants. Come up to us quickly. Save us. Help us. For the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. Let's stop the story there. Because to me, this is very interesting. Imagine that you are Joshua and you are one of the Israelites, and you have been tricked by these Gibeonites into making this covenant. And you made the covenant, and okay, now you made it. And already we've seen that when the other Israelites wanted to break that covenant and attack, Joshua said, can't do it. We made a covenant with them. We can't raise our hands against these people. But now you get a messenger who comes into camp panting and tattered and like he's just run top speed 25 miles, which is exactly what's happened. And this messenger tells you about the plight. There are 5 Canaanite kings and they're about to wipe us out. What's the temptation if you're Joshua? Oh, really? That's too bad. Yeah. Our hearts really go out to you, but you remember what a lousy group you were and what you did to us? And how could Joshua justify that? What might Joshua say? We're not the ones doing it. We're not the ones breaking the covenant. We're not going to lift our hands. It won't be our sword that kills the people of Gibeon. Who's doing it? These other godless kings. So, what could a person even be tempted to say? Thank you, Jesus. Look how you have worked to bring destruction and devastation to the people that were our enemies, that tricked us, that did us wrong. Does that sound familiar to anybody in this room and your relationships with people in this world? Have you ever had somebody that opposed you or did something wrong to you, and then later on something bad befalls them? And where is our attitude often when that happens? What do we say? I think of 3 words, 3-word sentence. Yeah, they deserve it. Serves them right is what I was going to say, but same thing. Yeah, serves them right. They deserve it. And there's a possibility that should that happen, you might just spend a little extra time in worship that night, or a little extra time thanking God for how he has delivered his servant and shown, who was right and who was wrong. That's a very human side of us, isn't it? And when that happens, you could say, well, but look what they did. And I understand. The people of Gibeon, they deceived the people of Israel. But when Joshua hears about the plight, there is nothing in the text that says that Joshua for a moment said, yes. Oh, should I or shouldn't I? Should I or shouldn't I? Not at all. In fact, the response is so incredible. The response is so incredible. But you find that Joshua is a man who keeps his promises. Maybe these words sound familiar to you, but above all, my brethren, James wrote in James 5:12, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but your yes is to be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. This idea of saying one thing before God and then changing your course afterwards. Jesus said something like that in the Sermon on the Mount too, didn't he? And there he's talking about the practice of the Pharisees, where they could make oaths but swear by different things. Oh, I swear not by the temple but by the gold in the temple. And different things were binding, different things weren't. It's like, again, like with kids, when we have our fingers crossed behind our back and say, well, then I don't have to keep that promise. I had my fingers crossed. And that's what was being practiced. And so when you see that emphasis by Jesus or in the New Testament, speaking against the tendency in man to say one thing and really never mean seriously to keep that, and then to go the other way when convenience dictates. And that's, again, a very human element, isn't it? How good do you think people in our society are doing right now at keeping their word? On a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say? 0, 5. 0, 5. How many think people in our society as a whole are like are at least a 5? At least a 5. At least a 4? At least a 3? Okay, I got a couple 4s there. 3s? How about a 3 in our society at large? 2s? How many say 1s? Okay, yeah, well, it depends on the person, you could say. How about this? How about in the church? In the church, how many say that people of the church, we tend to follow through with what we say we're going to do? Well, you give us a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. How many say we at least do a 5, at least a 5? Well, you guys are very gracious to us. Would you say an 8? Most people are like an 8 or a 9. Anybody? Yeah. Do you guys know the same people I know? Anybody say that people in the church sometimes are less than 5 in the lower half of following through on what they say? Anybody say that? Yeah, it depends on, I know it depends on the person. I'm really not trying to paint with a broad brush for everybody. I'm just saying the reality is that sometimes you see patterns in the world that make their way into the church and they become tolerated because everybody does it. And so it's kind of a, sometimes there's an elasticity in the timetable. What we are absolutely shocked that the world does and allows in the church, 20 years later, the church often will allow, and maybe 10 years later than that, will even embrace. But we always feel okay because the world has moved on to do even more shocking things. So we can always look at the world and say, but at least we're not like them. And that's a problem. I just want you to see, because I do think this is important. I know that for myself, for my wife, Connie, in ministry, how many times throughout years someone has said, I will be there, I will help with this thing, I'm going to do that, and then they don't show up, or you get a call at the last minute, oh yeah, we're not going to make it, something else. And sometimes it could be something just very mundane that comes up. Well, we decided we'd like to stay home and watch this TV show instead, or something like that. And I know in situations like that where we've at times said, oh, but they said they were going to be here, we were counting on them. And it's an interesting thing that I do think we need to examine ourselves and that say, when we give our word and say, I will be there, I will help with this. I know that true emergencies happen. I understand that real accidents happen, of course. But that should mean a commitment that we truly commit ourselves. When Joshua and the Israelites said to the people of Gibeon, we are making a covenant with you. We are making a covenant of peace. Then when Joshua hears from the Gibeonite messenger that sent that Gibeon is in terrible distress and danger, Joshua does not for a moment, anything in the texts show that he thinks, what a nice opportunity from God. Rather, what does he do? They spring into action, and I mean they spring into action. Look at this. Having heard the peril that 5 kings are there arrayed against them, so Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him and all the valiant warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, Joshua went up from Gilgal. Remember Gilgal, where he's at? Let's back up here. Gilgal is all the way over here. And it's a 25-mile journey. Keep that in mind, 25-mile journey. So there the Israelites are. They're, sort of got a good beachhead coming into the land. And now they hear that Gibeon is in danger. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him and all the valiant warriors. The Israelites go up in force, not just a few of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, now look at what God says, and this is one of these great times where God affirms his promise. Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. Wouldn't that be great to get a message like that from God in a problem that you're facing? And I know that we have that when we look at the promises of Scripture. But this is something that's special in that day as God is intervening in the community life of Israel to rescue them. And God is speaking directly there to Joshua. And Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. Isn't that a good slam dunk word from the Lord? I'd like to have that every time, wouldn't you? So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. By marching all night from Gilgal. How far did we say it is from Gilgal? Or from Gilgal to Gibeon? 25 miles. Now, many have pointed out you couldn't have gone that far in one night. And perhaps that's not the meaning. Perhaps it means that they started out that day, that morning, but when it became evening, they marched on through the night. And in a forced march, you certainly could do that, although it would be exhausting. Have you ever pulled an all-nighter driving? Anybody here do that? We did it years ago. That used to be the regular way that we would drive to and from Iowa. And I don't know. I'm curious if I can do this still. We've not been called upon because airplane flights became so cheap. But that used to be how we would drive. And I tell you, I was a driving maniac. Slip me behind the wheel, give me enough coffee, and I could drive 24 hours straight. And just, and Connie would take care of the kids, and they'd all sleep, and everything would be just hunky-dory. I know how it's possible to drive a car that far and for that long. But you know how you feel when you drive 24 hours and you get out where you're going? This is why I was so glad when we started getting cheaper ways to get there. The first day you get there, you just are in a fog. And then the next day, you still don't feel quite human yet. So you really don't feel good until the third day that you're there and the vacation's halfway over. So it's like, and then you got to hop in the car and drive through again. You say, why did you drive all night like that? Have you ever driven in a car with 4 kids in the daytime? Yeah, they're enjoying it for about the first 30 minutes. And you say, well, kids, we got 22 more hours. So we found it was best to try to make time while the kids were all sleeping, and it worked out great. But now, this is Joshua. He sets out with the army, with everybody, that's all his valiant warriors. And this is how urgently they go to meet the need of the crisis of the people of Gibeon. They don't say, we will take our time and get there when we get there. By the way, if you go back to chapter 9, you'll see there that when the people found out what Gibeon did and they went to confront the elders of Gibeon and say, what is this thing you've done to us? It took 3 days for the Israelites to get from Gilgal to Gibeon the first time. Now they do it in 1 day, including overnight, in forced march. And it just shows you the urgency with which they are answering the bell to meet the need of these people that they have made a promise to before God. And so they march through the night. So they get there. You know they are fresh as a rose. And what chance are you going to have? And I can hear, humanly speaking, somebody does that. You say, that's foolish. You're not going to be any good when you get there. Again, you're going to feel like a zombie when you get there. But when they get there, here's the thing. Who is giving the victory in this battle anyway? Yeah, see, there you go. So it's not that if you've got everything lined up exactly right and you guys have really trained in your strategy and gone over your battle plan and you have, God has already promised. So when they get there, then you continue to read this. And the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah, as they fled from before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth-horon. The Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. God sends an incredible judgment upon them. And again, if we look back at this map that we have here, the Israelites, they are chasing them from Gibeon, and they are heading as they chase them down to Azekah, and on down towards. They think this would be where Makkedah is, down here near Lachish. Not absolutely sure, but it's somewhere in the middle. There's a few different ideas on this. So the Israelites are chasing them along this pathway, and there's a natural route that you would go. And as they are traveling, God is raining these hailstones upon them. You talk about a bad hailstorm. And because of that, and this is the judgment of the very direct hand of God, more of these nations, more of their army dies from the direct hand of God through the hail than through the Israelite sword. And notice there too that the Lord confounded them before Israel. Well, what about these 5 kings and their armies? And surely they're ready to fight, and they're confused. Now, how that was confounding went, we've seen some other times that you get that we get more detail on that, where they think that the Israelites have a much greater army than they do, or sometimes they think that the Israelites have already killed one another, and yet that's not happened. And sometimes they hear sound of many horse hooves, and there's actually no horses there. So whatever God does here to confuse them, they go fleeing away, and the battle is going on. And just stop and think of this. So, and this to me is a question that becomes important or pertinent to us again. So who is it that wins the battle for Israel with the enemies of Gibeon? God. And we all would agree, God's the one responsible. God's the one who does it. And so we would all say in our lives, as you look at the battles going on in us, as we want to be changed to be more like Christ, we would all very, very quickly agree with what Paul says in Philippians 1:6, "For I'm confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus." And we'd all say, that's right. God's the one that gives the victory. God's the one who is at work hammering away and changing me to be more like Christ. Yes. But when you look at the text, again, don't you see that the Israelites have a part? Is it easy to march all night long to come upon the army? And notice, they came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. The last thing that the commanders of these 5 nations would have thought when they see the messenger escape and go running out, heading towards Israel, they're all going, it'll take an army a few days to get here. We have plenty of time. The very next morning, here's Israel. And imagine the shock. And so the battle is joined and there's confusion everywhere. But it's hard to march at such a forced pace, I'm sure, all the way through. You have to go into battle, and the Israelites do. And although God kills more with the hailstones, yet there are those who are killed with the sword of the sons of Israel. And you go on in this, and this is where you get one of these great moments in the Bible. One day we'll get to see the video, I hope. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, these are the words of Joshua, "O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. There was no day like that before it or after it when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. This is a once in all creation kind of thing, it sounds like. A beautiful bit of Hebrew poetry put together in describing what happens. As he prays this in this prophetic prayer, this poetry of statement and restatement. O sun, stand still at Gibeon. O moon, in the valley of Ajalon. And oh, God, give us victory here. The sun stood still, the moon stopped. Now you see there very clearly who's at work? God. Who interceded so that God would move like this? Joshua. So, great miracle. Funny thing about this miracle is there's a lot of discussion about exactly how God did this. How did God do it? And I'm going to tell you, I have only met a couple of people in my lifetime who absolutely do know how God did this, but they don't agree with one another, so I won't cite them. Because sometimes you get that where somebody, absolutely, I had a Sunday school teacher in a church I was attending when I was at Bible college. He knew exactly how God did this. So, but if you read a commentary, you'll find out that there's a lot of discussion on it of how did God do it? How do you think God did it? That's his business, yeah. But how? Let me say this. How could he have done it? What's some ideas? How could he have stopped the sun and the moon?
The lithosphere slips.
Okay, so you're speaking there about our atmosphere and
Our surface slides on molten lava.
oh, okay. So you stop us, but let the molten lava keep going around inside the Earth's core.
The Earth's core is still spinning, but
Okay. Now, if you say that couldn't have been, then what was it? Somebody else have an idea? Think that some of you thought, well, it's all a miracle, right? We're going to say it's a miracle no matter what. How else could it have been? Anybody ever hear on that or think about it? Could have just hit the brakes for okay? And he could have done it another way yet. How about the language of appearance? That he stopped what they saw. Some say, well, it was an issue of refraction. God allowed the light of the atmosphere to remain. He in some way refracted so that it looked as though the sun had stopped and the moon had stopped. Yeah, so here's the discussion. With whatever you say, and this is what's funny, I don't know why there is that Christians have this desire to say, I figured it out sometimes. But here's what people say. Well, you say that he stopped, whether just the outside of the earth layer or the inside, they say, or the whole earth. They say that's impossible because if God stopped the earth like that, there would be tsunamis and there would be earthquakes and there would be all kinds of cataclysmic things. This is God we're talking about, right? Yeah. And so it's what if? And then someone else says, no, he couldn't have changed the heavens because then that would be deception and God would be lying. But people will argue those points with this and say, I've got to figure this out. I want to say how it's done. And no matter how you look at it, if you're trying to explain it by natural phenomena, you've lost the battle already because you're trying to say God is limited by natural means, natural processes. And the reality is, if God wanted to simply suspend time and stop everything in that sense, but let the battle on the battlefield go on for that time and then restart the time of the rest of the universe, he can sure do it. But however he did it, he did it. And he did it, and it's not something that he's going to be doing every day. So I wouldn't bother praying on this. If you need time to get your house cleaned for company or test studied for, probably this is not going to happen because this is a once in a lifetime, not just a lifetime, once in creation kind of a thing, it sounds like. In fact, is it not written in the book of Jasher? There are occasionally these references to books that were history books of their day or books that were chronicles kept by the Israelites or sometimes by the palace, in the court records of a palace. And these aren't talking about Bible books, but apparently this was written down in the day that the book of Joshua was written. Sun stopped in the middle of the sky, did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Now again, this is obviously language of appearance, that the sun did not hasten to go down. And somebody could say, no, God, this is wrong. God couldn't have stopped the sun because the sun's not going anywhere. It's the earth revolving that got stopped. And so look, there's an error in the Bible, the skeptic says. And you always point out with that, this is the language of appearance, which we speak with all the time. And I like to bring up in that moment that, even the most scientific atheistic meteorologist, when he's walking on the beach with his wife, will say, honey, look at the beautiful sunset. Or you can look on your phone right now. If you ask Google, what time does the sun rise? Or what time does the sun set today? Google will tell you. It doesn't say, that is not a scientific question. Actually, the earth is rotating. No, it's a language of appearance. So we understand, and the Bible comes to us in that same kind of language that we use to communicate, to speak. So not a problem unless you're just looking to find fault. But know this, whatever happens, God stops. He stops time, so to speak, for a day as far as the movement of these celestial bodies. Now, I've got to say, perhaps you've heard before the story of the guy who worked for NASA, supposedly, and he was calculating for one of the early missions, and the things seemed to be out of line just a little bit and where they're supposed to go for the particular orbit that they were shooting for. And so he researched back and found the missing day in the book of Joshua, or the additional day maybe in the book of Joshua, however the story goes. If you ever see that, I just want you to know that's one of the earliest urban legends that ever got out there. That's been debunked, that never happened. There was nobody doing that. It's just a story somebody wrote. So don't repeat that one because it's not a good one to give us credibility. However, God did it, and that's fine. Joshua, with all Israel with him, returned to the camp at Gilgal. So Joshua and all Israel, they finish this battle. They go back to the camp at Gilgal when everything is done. Now we go back to the battle for a moment to read a little bit more about what goes on. But let me just, before we finish with that, just bring up again this point of, so who's doing the work in this? Who gets the credit? Well, obviously, God is the one who promises the victory. God is the one who guarantees. He's the one that confounds the enemy, the one that rains the hail upon the Israelites. He's the one that, upon the enemies of Gibeon. He's the one who stops the sun, and so that there can be longer time for the battle, right? But while the sun stands still, what's happening while the sun is standing still and the moon is stopped? Until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. What does that mean? That means battle. That means warfare. That means Israelites with swords and spears going into battle with these armies of these 5 kings, which means that there was some effort and work on the part of Israel as well. And I say this because I don't want us to be so complacent that we say, because see, I take these lessons, and if you take Romans 15:4, that the things that were written earlier, beforehand, were written for our benefit, so that through the instruction and hope of the Scriptures, right? It's for our spiritual growth. And this is the thing that we need to see. There's a lesson here. In my Christian life, I dare not say, Jesus is going to grow me up in Him, and God is going to use me for His kingdom, and I'm going to mature and become more like Christ just because I belong to Him. I think I will fold my hands and just seek out, therefore, my own pleasures and enjoy life down here and just know that God's at work. And if you do that, you're missing half the equation as far as Christian growth, Christian victory. Yes, God is at work to perfect us until the day of Christ Jesus, His work. But 1 Timothy 4:7 have nothing to do with worldly fables fit only for old women, Paul says to Timothy. Sorry for any older ladies, but this is an issue that's going on in their day. The gossip going with some busybodies. And on the other hand, Paul says, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. And then he goes on to talk about the difference between physical discipline and spiritual discipline. Physical discipline, he says, is good for just a little while. But spiritual discipline, that, he said, is good for eternity, for life. This is good for godliness, for our walk with God. Likewise, you look at Romans 13. Do you see a part in this passage that has to do with what we do? Do this. He starts it out in Romans 13. Do this, knowing the time, for it's already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. The night is almost gone, the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. Do you hear there the part that we have in this thing, in this equation? Now, I'm not saying that we do our sanctification. We're not the ones that give the victory, but there is definitely a part of obedience that you cannot miss. You can't argue that that's right there in the text. We're the ones that have to do this, knowing the time. I like that passage, by the way, because it talks about how salvation's nearer to us than when we believed. When you got saved, whenever you got saved, whether you got saved as a child or a teenager or a young adult, or you got saved just a month ago, let me tell you this. Every day you have less time on this earth. You are closer to getting to go home and see the Lord. I mean, ultimate salvation. The salvation of either us going to see the Lord through the veil of death, or of the Lord coming through the clouds for His church. Whatever it is, one day we're going to be rescued from all of this. And every day that passes, we are closer than when we first believed. And this sense of urgency, it's almost like the urgency of the Gibeonites are being attacked. Go! And they rush off. There's this aspect of don't just be lazy in your walk with God. Don't just, well, the Lord will do it. Don't worry if He wants it done. There's a sense in which we are also to be diligent. Be diligent in your faith. Be diligent in your application of the biblical text. And so Israel, they are diligent. And so you read their pursuit. Now we go back to the battle. Now these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave at Makkedah. Now Makkedah, again, is sort of in the middle of the land. It was told Joshua, saying, the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave of Makkedah. These 5 kings, as their armies are being defeated, they all find each other and say, hey guys, let's stick together. We're royalty. So Joshua is told that they found them hiding in a cave. Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and assign men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them in the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand. Now again, look at the mixture there. Chase them. Don't let the armies enter the cities. Then they'll close the doors and the gates. And then we've got to take a city that's there fortified with the gates shut, with all its archers and defenses. So he says, chase them down. Don't let them get there. Chase them down and attack them in the rear. Don't allow them to enter their cities. Well, why? For the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand. So be diligent to do your part because God's given you the victory. Not, well, let them go, guys. It doesn't matter. God's going to give you the victory. Just notice how this goes together. There's in your Christian life, there are things that you're called to do. And we're responsible. We're responsible to be reading the Word. We're responsible to be praying, to be trusting God. We're responsible to be seeking to use our spiritual gifts as we follow the burdens God places on our heart and the abilities that He gives by His Spirit. We are to be witnessing to people. We're to be seeking out fellowship so that we can spur one another on to love and good works. All these things we're to be doing in our Christian life is part of what we do. And yet we understand that the growth that comes not from us, but from God, through the Holy Spirit. It's an interesting mystery. And the Israelites the same way. So it came about when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter. As they catch these armies, they conquer them, slaughter them, until they were destroyed. The survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities. So a few of them make it into the cities, but most do not. That all the people returned to the camp to Joshua and Makkedah in peace. No one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. Everybody's happy now. No one's grumbling. What are we doing going to help the Gibeon? Nobody in Israel saying a thing now. God has just given them a great victory. Then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. They did so and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave. The king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon. When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. So they came near and put their feet on their necks. This is in line with what all the kings of the east would do in that day to demonstrate that they had conquered this enemy. And the Egyptians did this. We know the Assyrians did this. We see that in the carvings that we have. And Joshua says, do this. Now you do this, because this is a symbol that God has put these people completely in submission beneath us. And so, come, put your feet on their necks. By the way, that sounds rather brutal and harsh. These are brutal and harsh days that we're reading about. Again, the people of Canaan were not like living in nice, gentle kingdoms. These people were brutish. They were absolutely opposed to God. They were pagan in every way and violent. And these people, God is giving the land after centuries of patiently waiting, and now the time is there to eradicate them. Joshua then said to them, and look at this, where did you hear this before? Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous. Joshua is sharing with the nation the words that God gave him before their whole campaign started. For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight. So afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. Again, these are brutal times. It came about at sunset, he gave a command. They took them down from the trees, threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, put a large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. Interesting kind of prophetic sense there about they hang on the trees through the day, but when night comes, they take them down. And reminds us of what happened with the crucifixion, doesn't it, with the Jews. So it's Passover, time to take them down. There's a sense of propriety there. Then Joshua captured Makkedah on that day, struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed it and every person who was in it, left no survivor. Thus he did to the king of Makkedah, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed from Makkedah to Libnah, fought against Libnah. The Lord gave it also and its king into the hands of Israel. He struck it, every person who was in it, with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor in it. Thus he did to its king just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it and fought against it. And the Lord gave Lachish into the hands of Israel. He captured it on the second day, struck it, every person who was in it, with the edge of the sword, according to all that he had done to Libnah. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish. Joshua defeated him and his people until he left him no survivor. And you just keep going in the text, and everything we read here is victory, 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 as the Israelites are striking these different nations. Interestingly, one city, nation, or kingdom that they do not attack is Jerusalem. The king who started it all, they don't go and attack and win Jerusalem for whatever reason. And Jerusalem, at that time, was actually called Jebus. This is a name that's given Jerusalem after the fact, but Jebus, that city continues to be inhabited by Canaanites until the time of, remember, King David, which is going to be a few centuries in the future yet. But in the end, when all said and done, Joshua captured all the kings in their lands at one time because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. God is at work giving victory. The people are at work obeying and doing what they should do. And in the end, God fulfills his promise. And that is how it is when we walk with God. Father, I pray that you would help us to keep our hearts in tune with you in our walk. I pray that whatever struggles we're facing, that we would see it as an opportunity to trust you and yet also to step out and obey. I pray that you would stir our hearts to do that. Thank you that you are at work in our lives today, just as you were in ancient Israel. There's no doubt you are a great and glorious King, and we praise you. Amen.